Welcome to the Victims and Villains podcast. This is the show where we sock nerd, we sock hope, and we speak nothing else. I'm your host, Captain Nostalgia, and on today's episode, we have a very special set of guests who just celebrated 150th episodes, and they're here to answer the age-old question, which is better, Nintendo 64 or the Sega Genesis? Please tell me in welcoming two of the best dudes that I ever met on the face of this planet, Anthony Rippo, Larry Mormon, Retro Gamers.
And welcome to the Retro Gamers Podcast, episode 151. That's right, folks. If you haven't figured it out by now, we're pulling a hybrid. Larry here.
And Anthony here.
And Josh over there.
What's up?
And Josh over there eating a muffin.
Yeah, so we're here doing the hybrid episode with our boys over at Victims and Villains. Over at Victims and Villains, Josh. Always great to do these episodes. Yes, we're going to talk Nintendo versus Sega, but I'm still reeling from episode 150. I mean, it was a party.
Yes, it was.
All right. Yes, end. That's for you, Frank. So we've finally broken through. We're episode 151 now. Josh, of course, you were the one that reminded us that we were hitting 150. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, congrats.
My brain was like in another country, literally, and so it just didn't register. So we appreciate the shout out for that.
No problem. Got to keep you guys accountable.
Yeah.
Yes,
And just a note, really quickly, you had mentioned in your open that we're two of the best dudes you've ever met, and I just have to point out, you haven't met that many people, have you?
Aw, that is very accurate. Well, not the meeting part. Hold on, filler. Not the meeting part, but I think Josh, ever since, Josh was, gifted a wonderful gift from the Retro Gamers. I feel like now I think he's expecting more from us. And we're going to give him that in a wonderful episode, Nintendo versus Sega. And I think we're going to have this one in the bag.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
I'm hoping my nostalgia kind of backs me up on this, so we'll see.
You guys have way more energy than I do today. Sorry.
It is the time difference. I keep forgetting the time difference.
Yeah, no, I am still jet lagged. I am absolutely positively still jet lagged.
It's all right. We'll work through it. Josh, we're going to have to carry him. It's okay.
All right. Sounds good.
So I guess let's get right into this. Sega, Nintendo, probably, biggest battle since the Hatfields and the McCoys. The 90s for video games was absolutely defined by these two. A lot of people may say Atari and Coleco, or in television, throw all those in, but there wasn't that battle like there was with Nintendo and Sega, in my opinion.
No, agreed. Absolutely. I mean, Nintendo, when Sega came around, tried to compete in the marketplace, I mean, they were pretty much the only ones that managed to take it to Nintendo. Just like a tit for tat, basically, because the other, all the other companies out there, they had a piece of the marketplace, but it was never that big. Sega was the only one, I think, back then that was actually able to not only take a piece of the market, but take a sizable piece of the market from Nintendo. And if anything, they were the considerable threat to them for a while.
Which is interesting as a whole, because you have Sega, like, now basically was in its like height, whereas Nintendo has kind of kept going. They've proven their longevity with these great games and iconic characters, Legend of Zelda, Mario, Donkey Kong, and Sega has really proven that in its heyday, like they were able to really bring the fight to them, because you look at what Genesis was able to offer as far as like a library, and it has some really, really fantastic games. But N64 has equally some of the best games ever set to cartridge.
With the you're right. I agree with you on that one, Josh. With the N64, definitely was in the 90s the pinnacle of Nintendo, mostly because the 90s were ending, and that was the last system in that era. The Genesis, we're going to talk N64, but I think the Genesis really went to battle with Super Nintendo, and then, the Genesis with Super Nintendo, the Dreamcast really with the N64 at that point, but with the two companies, period. Oh, I hope you didn't hear that. With the two companies, period. You know, it was a battle of the ages, and it really kind of, you know, it split it down the line. Were you a Nintendo guy? Were you a Sega guy? I know me and Anthony, obviously, we were Nintendo guys. We had Sega games, but and I mean, do you remember really, like, did you have any groups of friends growing up who just were strictly Genesis? Like strictly Sega?
Yeah, I remember a couple of friends who did that, and just also bear in mind before I know we're talking Genesis and Super Nintendo because they were really the two that clashed head to head. But we also got to remember, you got to go back a little bit further than that, because in the 80s, we were actually talking about the original NES, which was the main, you know, entertainment console from Nintendo, and the Sega Master System, which predated the Sega Genesis. The Sega Master System didn't do as well as Nintendo, and the Sega Genesis came out actually in the 80s. It came out in 1989 and first started competing with the Nintendo. It took Nintendo 2 more years before they came out with the Super Nintendo in 1991. So Genesis, or Sega, I should say, kind of had a leg up on the 16-bit competition because they wanted to get to market, you know, first, even though the TurboGrafx actually beat them to the market, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, I mean, I had friends who were Sega only. And then at the end, to be honest with you, at the end of the day, really, there were no losers in that sense. There were just winners because Sega and Nintendo both had really awesome games. A lot of them had the same games because developers were putting games out on both systems. So it really, to me, it didn't matter which one you had. It just depended on what your preference was. Now, granted, like you said, Larry, you know, 2 of us were Nintendo guys. And then, obviously, when you got past that point and Nintendo 64 came out before the Dreamcast, there was the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was the first one to actually compete with the N64.
So, stop me if I'm wrong, but...
Stop.
I don't even know that.
Okay, go.
You set them up.
So you have the Genesis that came in late 80s, 2 years prior before the Super Nintendo hitting 16-bit. Now, for those that may or may not know, on the victim side, the NES was an Americanized version of the Famicom from Nintendo in the Japanese market. Now, would the Super Famicom have predated the Genesis, or is it still coming out the same realm?
I think, well, everything always came out over in Japan first. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the Super Famicom definitely would have come out slightly before the Super Nintendo, the North American version. I don't remember how far, maybe only a year back. I don't remember the Famicom coming out in 89. I don't know why 90s sticking in my head, but I've been wrong numerous times.
No, the Super Famicom, I believe, came out a little bit earlier. I want to say in 1990.
All right, so it wasn't that far off.
Yeah,
but still,
in fact, I'll pull that up right now. November 21st, 1990.
There we go. While Anthony fact checks that. So November 1990. So over in Japan, you know, there wasn't much of a time difference, but over here, 2 years, definitely a long time. Especially back in the early 90s when pre-internet, no one, you know, really, I never realized that even though these systems were made in Japan, I never put 2 and 2 together that there was, you know, games over there that may have been exclusive or come out before they came out over here. But I think when we talk about the war, we could talk about, you know, when this came out, when that came out, what predated what. But ultimately, it boils down to the actual gameplay, the games themselves and the systems. And I think, you know, that's the meat of what we would talk about. And Anthony said a lot of games came out on both systems. And I think that is one of the two, in my head, one of the two criteria to really be able to judge how good the system was when you put 2 games head to head that came out on both systems, but also at the same time what exclusives the systems had. And I think that's where it's going to lead. Now, Josh, let me ask you, because obviously everyone knows me and Ant are Nintendo. You know, growing up, what did you have? You know, what are you playing now, and what do you even prefer now?
So I actually own so Genesis is one of the two systems that I currently own, and I love to go back and play some of those. So a couple weeks ago we talked about Disney remastering those games, and I love going back and replaying some of those old Disney games that they have. Toy Story is one of my favorite games to play on the Genesis. I love playing Aladdin, which is getting the remake or the reimagining, the re-release, modernized version. And I really enjoy those games. And to me, like N64, though, it on the opposite side from like growing up and going to like cousins' houses and playing it, like N64 had some of the best Mario games, had Pokemon games, it had some like really iconic games, and then just even, growing up now and being an adult and going back and having the chance to play some of the games, like it also had some super duds like Castlevania 64, Superman 64, and like I think in a large part that kind of plays to the overcomplication of some of the controls that some of those games had, whereas with Genesis you had a bit more of a simplified, straightforward controller, and so sometimes I think that the delivery of some of the Genesis like gameplay was a bit more smoother on that behalf than what it is. Like I have a love for both, but it's for different aspects. But I think that if I had to choose one, it would probably go with the Genesis, just simply because I have more nostalgic memories. I own one, I play it more often, and it just has that smoother gameplay.
You made some good points that literally just dawned on me, and I think this is how we should approach this. Let's do this. I think if we need to break it down, like I said, but even, Josh, there was some parts in there you mentioned, I think we could break down even further. Let's start with this. Everyone can talk about the games, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Let's talk about innovation. And I'm talking, if I may, the where Nintendo as a company is with their hardware versus Sega as a company with their hardware. Let's talk about the controllers. The input. That's how you play the game. Nintendo constantly evolved, and some of the controllers that came out for Sega, they were, I'm not going to say weird, but they were definitely innovative as well. Anthony, who would you say maybe even had the best longevity as far as these input devices, these controllers? Nintendo came out with some weird ones as well.
Yeah, Nintendo I mean, they both came out with some interesting ones and weird ones, and we'll get to peripherals later too, because I think Sega definitely came out with more.
I'm even
peripherals
just talking first party, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing that jumps out to me in terms of just controller wise is that and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Nintendo was the one who originated the L and the R button. Which
believe so, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's still being used today on pretty much every system. And not only that, now we have L1, L2, R1, R2 basically on every system. And I really thought that was a really interesting innovation, because never before were they like, hey, you know what, maybe players should use more than their thumbs when they play games, because you started accessing your index finger, and there was something really comfortable about using the L and the R buttons that just kind of enhanced the gameplay. So I really think that that was a great move on Nintendo's part. And and then obviously Sega answered back on that one with a 6-button controller when they started to come out with fighting games, because Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, things like that. But they had opted to just add a button to the actual pad. So in other words, they didn't put the L and the R, they just had the 6-button controllers. And then at the top they had you remember the mode button?
Yeah,
it was the mode button on the top right, and that was it. And I always felt like that worked just fine, but there was something about the comfort level of those L and R buttons that obviously we still use today that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, I think that with the shoulder, obviously with the placement of the shoulder buttons, it makes it a little more comfortable. Though in a fighting game, I did prefer, and I've gone on record saying I think like Mortal Kombat was better on Genesis. Just the way because the 6 buttons, as Anthony pointed out, were layered like 3 and 3, no shoulders. So I think that aspect of it, worked out in Genesis on a certain games. But yeah, the how Nintendo is constantly evolving their controllers, because look at all the systems. Usually when a new system comes out, the controller looks somewhat the same. Well, PlayStation, it is the same, but they always look a little of the same. Nintendo, every one of their systems, they go out and, when it got to GameCube, they're like, all right, I dare you to put as many buttons as you can on one controller. Yep. And they succeeded. So Nintendo's always thinking that way.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I love about Nintendo is that they are constantly evolving, and like Sega is one of those, because if I'm wrong, like the Dreamcast controller was very reminiscent of the 64 controller, correct?
Not in design. Nothing looks like the N64 controller. N64 controller looks like a ninja.
Yeah, the N64 controller is just the weirdest controller I've ever created.
But it had it was the first one that had that. Remember the memory card on a Dreamcast basically was a little system itself. It would show stats, or it would show some sort of gameplay on it. And in the case of like a Sonic game, you can take the memory card out and play a Tamagotchi style game on the memory card separate from the system. So it was almost like the first second screen that we got in gaming, which was very innovative. The only annoying thing about the Dreamcast controller was that the wire stuck out from the bottom of the controller as opposed to the top. That was always on.
Yeah. Well, it was also kind of a, I mean, no offense, I love my Sega Dreamcast, and I still have it. Very happy with it. I was like, but that controller to me was always a big blocky mess. It was bulky. It was just like, it was very bulky, because when you were holding it, you were kind of holding it like this. It was just really, really huge. So, but yeah, I mean, to Larry's point, I mean, the VMU was definitely innovative at the time, which was really cool, and something I don't think we've seen since. I think was that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, not really. I mean, we get like Xbox tried doing like a second screen, I think, but with smartphones, so they would try incorporating that. But really, that little memory card was the first of its kind, and basically only. Josh, let me ask you this: when you play a game, like, are you looking for a game that really, like, style-wise? Because Sega, I feel, went the route of trying to bring arcade games home, where Nintendo was basically just trying to create games for the home.
Yeah, so you look at Nintendo's library for the 64, and there's definitely a plethora of variety that you can choose from. Like, you have your fighting games, you have your horror games, you have your superhero games. Like, you have all of these games that for different genres, so you're definitely appealing to more people, whereas the variety for Genesis definitely exists, but it's more geared towards the arcade crowd, where you have even some of the way that the movie games like Aladdin and Lion King and Toy Story, even the way that some of those they handle very much like arcade controllers. They have that two-dimensionality with it. And I think for like a true gamer, like, you're going to find joy in anything, but I think that Genesis kind of offers that experience a little bit better, whereas N64 was kind of something that you had its games were basically something to appeal to everyone. So it was a game that you could definitely break out in a party, in a sleepover, in whatever, and you look at what Nintendo would go on to do with the Wii, bringing like a very developing a very family-driven system. I think you see some of the early blueprints for that in the N64, where they're trying to bring games home and they're trying to bring games together that are going to unify, and you have these really good iconic games like Mario Racing. I'm trying to think of other ones.
Mario Party.
Like, you have games like that. Then you also have GoldenEye. Then you also have games like Perfect Dark, which is, gearing towards more like horror based and definitely trying to create that sense of, just adventure and trying to take the system into like new areas. And then also adding on, there was another Castlevania game released outside of 64, correct?
There was. They tried correcting on N64, there was they tried correcting basically Castlevania 64. I forgot the subtitle for it, but going back to the party aspect, and I mean, we've known each other for what, 25 years now. Remember, the N64 was, everyone would come over. Me, you, Anthony Chu, the Yin and the Yang podcast. You're welcome. And, a bunch of our other friends, and we would play on the N64. Forget about the WWE games, Mario Party games, all these multiplayer games. And let me ask you, do you think Nintendo had the edge on multiplayer games as opposed to Sega and their systems?
Well, I think there was no question that Nintendo actually had the advantage. I mean, first off, the system came out with 4 controller ports, so it was immediately known that they were planning on this to be a multiplayer system.
First system, I think, that did that. I think.
I believe so. You are correct. Yeah, because every other system, every Sega system, actually through all of their life cycles, were only two ports. You would have to buy the multiplayer adapter.
Well,
if you wanted to have more than that.
Dreamcast.
Was it Dreamcast? Oh, okay, my mistake.
It was also the last one, so.
It was the last one. But Nintendo, with the 64, they definitely were planning on the multiplayer. And to your point, we would just have 4-player games like nonstop with our friends and everything like that. I have really great memories of all 3 of my friends ganging up on me in every game I ever played with them, because they just didn't like the fact that I won all the time.
If live streaming was a thing in the late 90s, the amount of times you would watch Anthony rage quit a game because maybe we wanted to get him out of the Royal Rumble or try and beat him in a game, and the disrespect that we had doing it in his own house, because we always gathered at Anthony's house, it would have been a sight to behold, and we would have ruled the internet.
That's actually very true. There would have been a lot of viral videos of me being very angry.
I mean, you could recreate some of those, like.
I think we will. I think we will.
I think, that's coming soon to Twitch.
But and that, I think, where Nintendo leads to it. But not Genesis. I say Genesis, but Sega. I am going to give the edge to Sega for bringing that arcade style gaming to the home, even on the Genesis. Like the Double Dragon games were basically almost a direct port of the arcade. Josh, did you ever get a chance to really play the game Dreamcast?
I did not.
Okay.
So I unfortunately don't know. But to your point about you bringing the arcade home, one of the games that I do own is Mortal Kombat 2. So, when you play Mortal Kombat 2, Mortal Kombat 2 feels like you're stepping into an arcade setting right in the comfort of your own home, which I think was innovative. And I still think it's today is if you want to go back and be nostalgic, then it's really great for that purpose. And I think that the N64 has a whole set of other nostalgia memories, but as far as bringing the arcade into the home, that's definitely an edge to Genesis.
Yeah, there's no question about that. And I think one of the things you have to bring up when you call out the Genesis, if you want to talk about bringing the arcade home, the very first pack-in game for the Sega Genesis was Altered Beast. Let's not forget that.
Yes.
And that was a direct port from the arcade game, which I remember I used to play that in my pizzeria around the corner, all the time when we go there.
Altered Beast was
they had two arcade games. One of them was Altered Beast.
Oh, good old Prontos.
Yeah, which is awesome. And then, just to touch on, you had mentioned the Dreamcast. Let's not forget also one of the greatest fighting games ever created that was ported to the Dreamcast, which was Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Oh, the definitive game. I only had it on the PlayStation, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and on the PlayStation was only 2-on-2, but the Dreamcast got it to 3-on-3. Nowadays, it goes for a lot of money, so forget about it. And I definitely got my butt handed to me in that game on PlayStation more often than not in college. We're talking a lot here, Super Nintendo, N64, we mentioned the GameCube, Genesis, Dreamcast. I think where another thing, I want to hear you guys weigh in on this, where Nintendo has it over Sega is that we're not really mentioning the Saturn. So Nintendo has consistency with their systems where, it eventually led to Sega, where the Dreamcast became the last system that they put out. But they even had the Nomad, the Game Gear and stuff like that.
Sega CD.
Exactly. So Nintendo has more memorability? Yeah, sure. Than Sega does, in my opinion, because Sega was kind of hit and miss with their systems. I don't remember anyone having a Master System growing up.
I had one friend that had a Master System growing up, and I remember going over there and playing like a handful of games there, like Road Rash and Alex Kidd and stuff like that. And there was nothing wrong with the system. I liked the system. The only thing was, obviously I had a Nintendo, so. And at that time, I'm a kid. I can't get a system whenever I want like I can now because, mom and dad had to buy them. And what was the point of having more than one system at a time in your house? Because,
Meanwhile, you have like
that's
12.
what you got.
Yeah. No, that doesn't exist now.
I was going to say, now I have 25. I was like, but back then, you get one.
So, when you think, Josh, yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, when you think of gaming, what do you go to, Nintendo or Sega?
I think Nintendo has the more vast and iconic library, because you look at something like NES and the NES Classic that came out a couple years ago. You look at what a cultural, just iconic storm that was when it hit stores, and then the same with the Super SNES and the I did it on purpose.
I walked away for Victims and Villains.
Then you look at the N64, you look at Game Boy, you look at that's another thing too, is the handheld market. You have the Game Gear versus the Game Boy and all the variations that have come on the Game Boy. Like for Genesis, I think hit its height Sega hit its height at Genesis, whereas Nintendo kept reinventing itself. It felt almost kind of like every system was something for a new audience or something for a new crowd, to where you had the 64, but then you went to the GameCube, then you went to the Wii, then you went to the Switch. Like they're constantly reinventing themselves and saying, okay, this is what we've done before. How can we take what we've done before, repeat it, but completely reinvent it at the same time? And I think that's one of the things that, like you guys had said in the past, like all of these other systems constantly kind of stay the same. They're all third party, but Nintendo is kind of just over here quietly doing its own thing. And I think that's the reason why that we're seeing the Switch have the longevity that it's had. I don't think that when in 20 years from now, when we're talking about other systems, I think, this generation you have, was it PlayStation 4?
Yep.
And Xbox One. Like, I think that the Switch is going to be a heavy competitor to come up against that, and maybe even be the better system of the current generation that we have now, just because of its innovative, foraging.
Yeah, and innovation is always something Nintendo's been doing, but I think one of the more important things to look at when you look at Nintendo is the fact that they, as a company, looking at them as a company as opposed to Sega and all the other companies out there, but I feel like Nintendo never ever looked at themselves as a competitive system to everybody else. They have their business plan. They've always stuck to their business plan, and they have their processes and protocols that they follow. And never in there do they ever look like they're trying to compete with the other companies. They're just there doing their own thing. And again, something you bring up, the power of their first party games is what's always carried them throughout all of their life cycles, and they're perfectly fine with that. Like when they came out with the Switch, they knew that the Switch wasn't going to be as powerful as the PS4, as powerful as the Xbox One, but they released it anyway because they knew exactly what they were doing according to their plan. They're like, we know what we want to make, we know what our audience wants, and that's it. And that's what they focus on. And that's the reason why I always feel like they're successful. Are they as successful as Sony and Microsoft? No, they're not. But are they okay with that? Yes. And that's why they continue, to succeed. The only time where they almost faltered was with the GameCube. And this was another point I wanted to bring up while you were talking about this stuff, because you talked about third party. And I think this is what wound up ultimately dooming Sega, is because Sega's first-party library wasn't particularly strong. To your point, they would import arcade games. They would release a lot of games with like celebrity tie-ins. If you think about all this, like Joe Montana football, Evander Holyfield boxing, like they went out and they got a lot of stars to be in their games, but a lot of their power was from third party. And when the third party started to leave them, around the time of the Sega Saturn and the Sega Dreamcast, to me, that's one of the major factors of what ultimately sunk them, because they didn't have strong enough first party material to keep their systems afloat. Sony, meanwhile, when the PlayStation came out, had a ton of third party games, and that's what kind of helped them succeed. Nintendo, on the other hand, almost wound up sinking with the GameCube for the same thing. They did not have third-party support on the GameCube, while at the same time, they actually didn't have enough first-party support on the GameCube. And for a while there were talks of Nintendo not putting out systems after the GameCube. So it was, there was actually a time when Nintendo could have gone the route of Sega almost around the same time. So,
and that would have been weird. I would like a world without a Nintendo system. I mean, it was still weird with a world without a Sega system, but and it's and you look back on it, history always tends to justify things, and history I think is justifying the GameCube because, in my opinion, the GameCube is an extremely underrated system. The games that came out on it were awesome. But yes, they suffered first party and third party. Shockingly, you would think only one Mario game really came out on the GameCube, Super Mario Sunshine, which again is a good game, but no one really gives it credit.
But
I love that game.
I was gonna say it's the power of the launch titles, though. Also, you got to remember, I think when GameCube came out, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the first Nintendo system to come out without a Mario launch title. It also did not have a Zelda launch title, which were the two staples.
Did it even have a launch title? I don't think it did. Oh, wait, when you say launch title, hold on. You're not talking about a pack-in game. You're talking about games that came out at the same time.
Games that came out with the right. I believe Luigi's Mansion was the launch title.
Oh, God, yes. How could I forget?
Yes, it was.
Duh.
Yeah.
Shame on me.
But again, it was unprecedented for Nintendo, and and nothing against Luigi's Mansion. It's a great game. But I thought that was a major misstep with the GameCube. Because, and again, it took them a while before a Mario game came out. It also took them a while before, Wind Waker came out. So, and your system, the power of your system is going to be judged by how well it does at launch, because it's hard to make it up afterwards. It's the reason why Sony did so well with the PlayStation, because when the PlayStation came out at launch with their library, it did phenomenally well, and the rest is history. Whereas, when Sega Dreamcast came out, I mean, Sonic Adventure, amazing game. Absolutely amazing game on the Dreamcast. I love that game.
Yep.
But there was just there wasn't enough meat outside of that to really carry the system.
And then they tried... Yeah, go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, like, you even thinking, like, we've had how many different variations of like the Sega Classic, and it's not worth the money because you don't have that first party iconic status or replayability that a lot of them have. I think when you think of the Genesis as far as the really fantastic first parties, you have a couple, and most of them are Sonic titles. Whereas with Nintendo, you have all this first party, Legend of Zelda, you have Mario, Pokemon. There's just so much variety, but there's so much. They're so iconic now, and even in it's the midst of this war, they still held that high iconic status better, and that's the reason why you're able to go back and replay those games, is because not only are they iconic, but they are phenomenal games. They are some of the best games ever set to cartridge, like I had previously said.
Yeah, and to your point as well, now that we're getting into the world of the minis, NES Mini, Super NES, TurboGrafx coming out March of 2020. When this episode dropped, I have my Sega Genesis Mini somewhere. I don't know. But, the Sega Genesis Mini, the proper Sega Genesis Mini. Because you mentioned, Josh, a bunch of them came out. That was just more the fault of they were just faulty systems. This one's being made by Sega. But now in this world of these minis and people hitting that nostalgia, it's almost like the war is going to slowly start coming back. I mean, it's 2009. No, excuse me. By the time it comes out, it's going to be 2020. And again, we're going to have in the minis, people are already talking about the TurboGrafx 16 Mini. They're going to have the Sega Genesis Mini. We have on the Switch, the NES and the SNES libraries. Who knows if they'll do the N64 at that point. Yes. And, it's because that actually I think is going to come up on our feed. So, so yes, there is a unicorn. Oh, there it is, right there. Yep, new day. So yeah, I think we may actually be entering into the second phase, the Empire Strikes Back, if you will, of the console wars, which is very sad. Then I guess.
I think at this point, though, Nintendo's already won before it's even over because. Yeah, just hear me out. Like, to kind of put it in like terms that I think victims listeners will understand is you have Nintendo. Nintendo is basically the equivalent of Marvel and the cinematic universe that they created. And what is it now? 4 or 5 years later, then you have DC that comes along, or in this case, Sega, that says, "Oh, I want to get in on this nostalgia train. Let me just put together the system and then ship it out." And I think that all of the copycat Sega Minis or Genesis Minis, whatever they're calling them, I think that hype has just kind of been died down, because I remember when I first came across the one from it and I sent it to Anthony, I was like, this sounds amazing. And then he was like, "Oh no, it's not worth your time. It's not worth your money. It's utter garbage." And I think that is going to kind of put a damper in their sales. Whereas, again, with the NES Classic, like that was something that was innovative. Like, here you have this system that you can literally just plug into your TV, HD, all these games remastered, built right into it, flat rate. That's innovative. And now you have all these other systems that are trying to kind of take that steam and bring it to their own table.
Real quick, I just want to say, so Nintendo's Marvel, Sega is DC. Does that mean TurboGrafx is Sony, and that's why Bonk is never going to be seen on the Nintendo system again?
Yes.
Okay, just checking. Okay. So, Ant, do you have any? Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Wow. I'm hearing some reverb on your end.
All of a sudden, just out of nowhere?
Yeah. Maybe. Oh, no, it's gone. It's gone. All right, we're back. We're back. We never cut. Okay. So, yeah, Ann, your point to that.
No, my point to that was Josh, Nintendo definitely hit a home run when they came out with their minis. But before that, Genesis actually did have several minis in the market. And who's to say if Nintendo decided to do it in response to that? But to your point, it's the power in the companies that you sign. And when Sega signed with AtGames was the one who put out all those original minis that were poorly done. It was the poor quality on their part that led to them, being reviled. So is it Sega's fault necessarily? Not too sure, because once you sign a contract, you sign a contract. They obviously had faith in AtGames, and AtGames essentially kind of let them down. So
kind of,
and
definitely.
not to mention the fact that there were a slew of other, flashback consoles that were coming out. There was the Atari Flashback and Television Flashback. They had a whole bunch of other ones before the NES Mini came out. So, but what Nintendo did show everybody is this is how you do it right. And now Sega has come along, and I'm assuming what they did was, and again, this is like the business part in the background that most people don't realize, because it's like, well, how come Sega didn't put out, a good Genesis Mini Classic and everything like that? You got to wait for the contract to run out. And I'm assuming as soon as their AtGames contract ran out, they were like, okay, great. Now we can go make a good system with a better company, which is what the the Genesis and Mega Drive Mini is going to be when it releases later this month. At least that's
fair.
Yeah, I think that's to my assessment.
That's fair. I didn't even kind of really consider the business aspect of it because, with the At Games contract, you got to imagine like it probably wasn't just for a one-off. It was probably for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good point. And
they released
too that.
I was going to say, they re-released that Mini so many times with At Games. And remember, the selling point to it was the fact that it played Genesis games. Like the new one that's coming out, it's not going to play Genesis. It's going to be like all the other ones. It's going to be preloaded, and that's it. But At Games, and I bought one. Look, I was oh, sweet, this is awesome. And it's kind of like a new Genesis system. But it was the hardware that just did not do that justice.
Exactly.
And not only that, it said, oh, it's preloaded with 80 games. Yeah, 30 of them were Genesis games. The rest were all homebrews. So, that's where that goes.
And on top of that, on top of that, to your point, like they kept coming out with new ones over and over again. I don't think that was necessarily on Sega's part. That was on At Games' part. They were trying to milk.
I don't blame Sega at all.
They signed. Yeah, they were just trying to milk it. They were like, let's make as much money as we can since we have the license for Sega games, and so they just kept coming out with different versions over and over and over again, trying to be like, all right, everybody, buy this one. We swear it's better, and it just wasn't.
No. I've never played it, but from I would rather spend the $60 on or however much it was on a refurbished system and some games because I know that at that point I'm going to get to play the games that I want to play, and that's kind of something that held me off from wanting to play the PlayStation Classic was because while I love the PlayStation 1, none of the games that they had on it were something that I wanted to pay for. It's like, well, I mean, had it come with something like Tomb Raider or Gex or Spyro, these games that I felt like really defined the system for me, I would have thrown down the money then. But it's just kind of one of those things that I think the reason why Nintendo has those better systems and those the better games was just because they had a better library for games.
Well, a better first-party library. That's the thing to keep in mind. When the PlayStation Classic came out, you got to remember all those Sony PlayStation games that you loved, and we talked about this earlier, the power of the third party. And paying those licensing fees on Sony's part to put those games on the Classic wasn't worth the cost because, again, at the end of the day, they wouldn't have made as much of a profit, if any profit, off of the Classic system had they had to pay all of those third-party licensing fees.
And this is where, and we've talked about it on Retro Gamers, this is where I disagree politely with Anthony, whereas a lot of look, on any of these mini systems, no one is ever going to agree that the entire lineup is great. There's always going to be a game that you wanted on there that's missing, or a game on there that you don't want to see. That with that being said, I feel the reason why you don't see Symphony of the Night, Tomb Raider, Spyro, Crash on the Mini, on the PlayStation Mini, I can't remember if it was on there or not, is because, short of Tomb Raider is the only one that I will give, you know what, that should have been on the system. But Spyro, Crash, and Symphony of the Night were just re-released on the modern consoles around that time in different bundle packs. So, why immediately then put it out on the Mini when, half, if not 3/4 of these people already own a Xbox, probably, and a PlayStation, and they'll get those games on that. Again, that's my opinion. I'm not saying that's fact.
Right. And I was just going to say, just a quick counterpoint to it. Nintendo makes it a habit of selling you the same game over and over and over again. By the time the NES Mini came out, how many times have you purchased Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers 3, Legend of Zelda? I mean, a good at least 10 of the games on that system you've probably bought several times over the course of your life. So, frankly, it didn't stop them. It shouldn't have stopped Sony to do that, especially if they were even if they were releasing them on their PS4 and everything like that. For the nostalgia factor and the appeal to what made the Sony PlayStation such a great success, they should have definitely put those on the classic.
Here's the thing, though you mentioned first-party games on Nintendo. Of course, that they're going to re-release their own. The games I'm talking about are mostly third-party. So the third-party aspect says, you know what, we can get more money if we just sell it as the Crash Bandicoot triple pack or the Spyro triple pack that's coming out, or the Rondo of Blood 2-pack. Again, I feel like that's what
I said.
Yeah.
Yep. That's what I said. Licensing comes into play here.
No.
But
I'm
I
saying,
think too.
Yeah.
I was gonna say is like I've talked to you guys several times individually off the record and off recording, and you look at how much every system that comes out, whether it has been PlayStation, Xbox, Sega, mobile, Nintendo, they always have these digital stores, and a lot of these classic games you can now buy on digital stores. You've been able to do that for years, but I think that there's something about being able to play it on the system that it was created for. The system like Nintendo or Sega or PlayStation 1, like there's just something that goes hand in hand for that. It's like if I gave you guys a Sega Genesis that was filled, preloaded with all of these arcade ports, would you rather play that or the original arcade machine? You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And that's going to boil back down to the controller. It's why Nintendo released, it's already available on the Switch, the Super NES lineup, and they're selling separate, and you can play it with a Joy-Con. Absolutely no problem. We talked about it last week on episode 150 of the Retro Gamers podcast, how you can play the Super NES games now on the Switch, but they're selling a Super NES controller, because you're right, Josh, to your point, there's nothing like A, on the original system, but even B, with the designed controller that the game was meant for. Like, if they do an N64 lineup next year on the Switch, they had best be releasing an N64 controller, which I think would be awesome on the side point. But, I think it boils down to that. You're right. My head's going to explode.
Familiarity.
Yep. So the sameness of having the controller, with the game. Even if it's on a different system.
Yeah, as I say, no, and I have to agree with that as well. I mean, there's not as great as it is playing the games on the original console or in the the original style. The controller has as much value as playing the game, because it's that not only the nostalgic feel of it, but the comfortable feel of it. Because muscle memory is a big thing. So when you're sitting there playing the game. When I'm playing any game, even when I'm on my, when I'm on my PS4, I have some retro games on there that I've downloaded off the library. It doesn't feel the same playing it on a PlayStation controller. I do yearn for that, for the original controller when I play games. That's also why I kept every system.
To that point, well, you weren't around for Hurricane Sandy, so when the system, like, speaking of which, like for the Wii. When the Wii came out, that introduced the Virtual Console. And at the time, probably around that time, I don't think the nostalgia factor was really fully into play yet. To the point where people were still collecting, not keeping, but collecting the old systems again. So I remember when the Virtual Console came out, I was downloading everything. I'm like, sweet, I can finally play, Super Mario Brothers again. And yes, you can use the Wii controller sideways, as we have a guest now on the Retro Gamers podcast.
Snow wants to be part of the show. Okay.
Hello, Snow.
Hey, Snow.
Oh, Snow's going to kill somebody.
Oh, yeah.
So, you can use the Wii remote sideways, and that kind of gave you a feel. But it wasn't until years later when the NES Mini came out, and you're able to plug the NES controller for the Mini into the Wii and use that to play the Virtual Console. And I got to admit, as weird as it sounds, I started playing more of the Virtual Console because I had the NES and subsequently the Super NES controllers because they had that same dongle.
So all right, let me take this as we're kind of winding down. Let me take this in a direction. I think, we've talked about the success, we've talked about the longevity, but you fail to also, both companies had its blunders and its failures and being innovative. Most notably, you have the on one hand you have the what is this
failures for
the system?
What are you talking about, Nintendo?
What are you trying to hold, Josh, in your hand?
Sega. What is
Game
Genesis?
Saturn.
No, not Game
Gear, Saturn,
Dreamcast.
Oh, Dreamcast. Okay.
On one half, you have Dreamcast that kind of, basically shut the doors on Sega's console days. But then you also have the Master System, the Sega CD, Game Gear, all of these systems that aren't as iconic as the
Game Boy,
the Genesis, and Game Boy and other competitors. And then on the other hand, you also have Nintendo has the Virtual Boy.
All right. Look, we don't have to go in that direction. Okay.
Yeah, we almost made it the entire discussion without talking about the disaster that was the Virtual Boy.
Yes.
Now, for all of Sega's missteps, the 32X, which didn't do well, the Sega CD, which didn't do well, the Nomad, which also did not do well, they didn't even come close to the absolute trash bag that was the Virtual Boy.
But Sega also, not Sega, but Nintendo also had the GameCube, which really wasn't as revered as it was. Like you guys had just talked about, like it's a very underappreciated system. But at the same time, I think that, as much as Dreamcast is also unappreciated.
I'm sorry, we have to acknowledge that Larry is putting up these garbage games.
All Virtual Boy games. Fantastic.
Yeah.
But,
Josh,
at the same time, I was going to say, like, which one has the biggest failures, and are they truly considered failures because maybe they were ahead of its time?
Here, I don't honestly. I'm not trying to be like, oh, let's all be nice and cheery and everything, but I don't think really there aren't any failures that doomed either company because they're both still around. Both companies still here. As much as Sega isn't doing hardware anymore, they're still pumping out software that is fantastic. Yeah. There's still many Sonic games. Sonic Mania came out a year or two ago. Yep. That is phenomenal. So, as much as, they got out of the hardware business, even though they're technically kind of back in it with the Mini, but as much as they got out of the hardware business, they still thrived, which they did originally. The hardware this is what put it on the TV. It was their games that really made Sega, and it's showing today. Nintendo, on the other hand, since they were basically all in-house, and yes, there were some failures. Look, let's call it like it is. The Virtual Boy, the idea of the Virtual Boy was great. Innovative. Absolutely. Again, the idea was great. The execution of it, not so much. But look, you gotta try. You can't you're not gonna make it. A business isn't going to make it if they're not going to try at least. And Nintendo has proven, like you said, with the Virtual Boy, with the GameCube, even with the Wii U, which wasn't selling that good, they still tried, they still went for it, but they kept moving forward, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think, Larry makes some good points there. I would say, like, if we're talking about the console business, there's no question that Sega had more failures. There's a reason why they got out of the hardware business. They, at least, not even the hardware business, but the home console business. Their hardware business is doing perfectly fine. It's just not doing as well here as it is elsewhere. Because when I go to Japan and I'm traveling around there, there are more physical Sega locations where you can go and play arcades. Basically, there are a lot more arcades in Japan, between Osaka and Tokyo more so. But when I'm walking around there are two companies that I always see that have literally physical establishments, multi-level arcades. Like we're talking 4 or 5 floors worth of an arcade. And inside each one of them, there are like 5 to 10 of the same game. And packed with people. And the two companies are Namco Bandai, I got that backwards, Namco Bandai, and Sega. And so their hardware business is perfectly fine when you look at it from that front. When it came to the home consoles, Sega faltered. And again, I really do believe a big part of that was, again, first-party titles weren't as strong, and they didn't have a lot of third-party support toward, when the Saturn and the Dreamcast came out. Because I'll be perfectly honest with you, the Dreamcast definitely had a leg up on the Sony PlayStation and the N64. It was a lot more powerful system. again, they were coming out with some decent games, and on top of that, it was the first real system in the US to incorporate the internet. You were actually able to really go online, and that was going to be a major selling point for it. The problem was they did not have a library to sustain it, and that's where that's really what drove them out of the business. So if I had to say which one had more failures, I would definitely say Sega, but I wouldn't. But to Larry's point, it's not like it's sunk the company. The company is doing just fine.
And it's also kind of like it's gauging in different directions because, just because we don't really, I guess, like know about, like, Sega doesn't really know success in the States doesn't mean that it's not elsewhere. Yep. And to know that, like, there are like floods of people that are gathering around cabinets to play their machines, like that's a success that, I think I would ultimately give to Sega because, getting together on like a Friday night to go to an arcade and physically, be active and, you're not only are you presenting like health at that point, but you're also presenting community. And I think that that's a more vital to the gaming experience than saying, oh, hey, let's go grab a cold one and go play the newest Mario game. Like, to me, I think that is where Sega wins. Whereas, they've been innovative, I think, in different respects and different regards.
Exactly. And, and that's the same with Nintendo as well, because if you, granted, we all know Nintendo for what it is today, but if you know Nintendo's history, the company is almost 130 years old. They did not start with video games. They were a trading card company that was established in 1889. Yep. So, yep. We're talking. So it's actually celebrating its 130th year, according to my Wikipedia page that I have up right here. In a couple of weeks, September 23rd is their 130th year in business. So, again, we know them for who they are now. But again, we did not know the company that, when it began, how it built and everything like that. And it's the same thing today, where Nintendo makes all of their money now in video games. So does Sega. But, again, it all depends on where you are and what you're doing in terms of what your interests are.
And to wrap this up, Josh, next time you're in New York City, all right, let me know. And another, as much as Sega's all over Japan, I will bring you to the Nintendo store in New York City. There's no Sega store, but I'll bring you to the Nintendo store in New York City, and we'll check that out.
Let you know the next time that I'm up in the city. Bro, I'm going to be crashing on your floor the next time I'm in your city.
We will be talking. There is a Motel 6 about an hour and a half. No, I'm kidding. But, be that as... So, with wrapping this up here on a wonderful hybrid episode...
before you wrap it up, Larry, because I didn't get a chance to bring this up earlier, but since we've been talking... about Sega versus Nintendo, I want to do a callback to a book that I read probably last year, and we talked about it on the show, and we've talked about it before. But for anybody who is interested in learning more about the heated Sega Nintendo, battle back in the early 90s with the Genesis and the Super Nintendo specifically, Blake J. Harris released a book called Console Wars. Yes. And I highly recommend, if you really want to see what went down, give this a read. It's absolutely excellent. And it really gives you a good... Harris really did a good job of mining all of the information from the actual Sega employees. Nintendo, not so much, because they're not very forthcoming with information. Their information is very guarded. But he gets firsthand accounts from the people who made the Sega Genesis the success that it was. So you get a lot of information in regards to the history of the console wars between Sega and Nintendo. So I strongly recommend reading that book when you get a chance to Console Wars.
Also on that front, it is also being optioned out for a movie.
Yes.
And if I remember correctly, it is supposed to be from the producers of The Boys.
Oh,
cool.
I didn't hear about that. I thought awesome. What's this? I thought Seth Rogen had something to do with that. I guess not.
Seth Rogen is a producer of The Boys.
Oh, is he? I didn't realize that. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, then there you go.
And Preacher.
Yep. Doesn't surprise me. Seth Rogen actually wrote the foreword for this book.
Oh, well, all right. Well, that just put two and two together. There you go. And on that note...
All right. Well, where can people find you guys?
Nowhere.
Anywhere you listen to podcasts, check out the Retro Gamers podcast, specifically Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Podcoin, and anywhere else you listen. And they can find us on social media as well.
Yeah, you can find us on theretrogamers.com if you still look up traditional websites, or you can find us on Facebook. Facebook is our, where we put most of our, all of our information, facebook.com/retrogamerspodcast, Instagram @retrogamerspodcast. We are also, let's see, where the hell, you can, are we tweeting? We're not tweeting yet. We're
going to get there. Yeah, we're working on it.
Yeah, we're not big tweeters.
YouTube.
So, what?
YouTube.
You can find us on YouTube.
That's why you're watching us now.
If you want to watch us, if you're watching us right now, then you're already there. So thank you. But you can check us out on YouTube, and you may be able to, at this point, check us out on Twitch as well.
We're working on that.
TRG_podcast. We will be live streaming on Twitch. Either we already are, or we're moving forward to doing that.
All right. And more importantly, if you or someone you know is listening to this right now and you guys are struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, please reach out. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. There are 129 suicides that take place each and every day. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That's one death every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can reach out to us on any of our social medias at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You guys can call the Suicide Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Text HELP to 741-741, or go to victimsandvillains.net/hope, where you guys can get even more resources past the ones that I've just mentioned. And you guys can also find us everywhere at Victims and Villains, the social media that I just gave. You guys can like, follow, and subscribe to us on Twitch, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you guys get your podcasts from. Let us know what side you guys go with, Nintendo, Sega. Until next time, remember to keep talking nerd, talking hope, speaking nothing else.